You think you know the presidents of the United States, names, dates, maybe a few famous quotes, but what if I told you that one president believed in mole people, another was arrested while in office, and one actually kept a spy ring with invisible ink? This isn't your high school history class. These are the bizarre, buried, and downright unbelievable facts they don't teach you about the men who led America. And trust me, you're going to see some of them in a very different light. Ready to dig through the secrets? Let's start at the very top. George Washington's secret spy network. When we think of George Washington, we usually picture the stoic face on the dollar bill, wooden teeth, which weren't actually wood, and some cherry tree myth that never happened. But here's the thing. America's very first president wasn't just a military hero or a political figurehead. He was also a spy master, quietly orchestrating an intelligence network straight out of a Revolutionary era thriller. Yep, you heard that right. Washington ran a covert spy ring called the Culper Ring. It operated during the American Revolutionary War and was so secretive that not even Washington himself knew the real names of some of the agents involved. This wasn't some ragtag band of informants either. It was a well-organized operation that used code names, invisible ink, clothesline signals, and dead drops to pass on information under the noses of British forces. One of their cleverest tricks? Clotheslines. They would hang up laundry in specific patterns to signal safe houses or meeting locations. Innocent-looking housewives were actually critical parts of the ring, hiding messages in hollowed-out buttons or under pies. Think about that the next time someone says the founding fathers were just a bunch of serious old guys with powdered wigs. Washington understood something that few did at the time. Wars weren't just won on battlefields, they were won in the shadows. And he didn't just support this espionage strategy from the sidelines, he was deeply involved. He personally reviewed coded letters, approved missions, and even helped develop encryption techniques. To Washington, intelligence wasn't an accessory to war, it was essential. What's even wilder, the identity of one key spy, known only as Agent 355, is still a mystery. Some historians believe she was a woman embedded in British high society, feeding information back to the Americans right under redcoat noses. Her fate, unknown. Her real name, never revealed. Think about that for a second. The father of our country played the role of 18th century Jason Bourne, running a spy network that would inspire the foundation of what eventually became the CIA. And while schoolbooks focus on crossing the Delaware, they rarely mention the invisible ink he used to win the war. Makes you wonder what else got left out of the textbook, doesn't it? Because if George Washington was secretly running spies and decoding messages in the middle of the night, what could possibly be crazier than that? Well, how about the next guy, John Adams, who nearly declared war on France over some shady diplomats and later tried to jail his critics for insulting him? Yeah, the second president had a bit of a temper. Stick around. This ride's just getting started. John Adams, the president who despised Alexander Hamilton more than the British. If you think today's political rivalries are toxic, you haven't met John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. These two founding fathers didn't just disagree, they loathed each other. And unlike other feuds in politics, this one didn't stay behind closed doors. Adams, the second U.S. president, was brilliant, short-tempered, and paranoid. Hamilton was charming, power-hungry, and fiercely ambitious. But here's the twist. They were supposed to be on the same team. Both were key players in the Federalist Party, but behind the scenes, it was all backstabbing, scheming, and betrayal. Adams once called Hamilton the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. And honestly, that's one of the nicer things he said about him. Hamilton, for his part, thought Adams was unfit for office. Not just unfit, dangerously unstable. During Adams' presidency, Hamilton tried to manipulate cabinet members to follow his orders instead of the president's. Think about that. A cabinet that secretly listened to a former Treasury Secretary instead of the guy sitting in the Oval Office. Adams caught wind of it and nearly lost it. At one point, Adams fired 2 of his cabinet members for being more loyal to Hamilton than to him. He even accused Hamilton of trying to install a military dictatorship. Hamilton fired back by publishing a 58-page essay attacking Adams' mental health, leadership, and, just for good measure, his personality. This wasn't just petty drama. Their feud split the Federalist Party down the middle and helped hand the presidency to Thomas Jefferson in the bitter election of 1800. Imagine the sitting president getting torpedoed by someone from his own party. That's how deep the hatred ran. But the most unbelievable part? Adams once claimed he'd rather be ruled by a night watchman than see Hamilton gain more power. He said, quote, "The man is an intriguant, always busy, always ambitious, always reckless." It wasn't just personal, it was political warfare. Adams may have fought the British for independence, but he saved his most vicious battles for Hamilton, and the fallout changed American politics forever. Now, while Adams was locked in a bitter blood feud with Hamilton, the man about to take his place had some very different ideas, like proving that North America was home to mammoths and using science to win a culture war with Europe. Yeah, the next president wasn't just a statesman. He was a full-blown Enlightenment eccentric. Let's talk about Thomas Jefferson and his very strange war with natural history. Thomas Jefferson's secret children. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. He founded a university, collected over 6,000 books, and could read Latin, Greek, and French. The guy was basically a human encyclopedia. But behind that mountain of brilliance was a secret that historians tried to ignore for over 100 years. Jefferson fathered multiple children with one of his slaves, a woman named Sally Hemings. Let that sink in. The man who wrote that all men are created equal owned slaves and had children with one of them. For years, this was brushed off as rumor. Jefferson's defenders called it slander, lies, political smear, but DNA testing in the 1990s confirmed what enslaved families had been saying for generations. Jefferson fathered at least 6 children with Hemings and raised some of them at Monticello, his famous estate. Even more bizarre, Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Jefferson's dead wife. They shared the same father. That means Jefferson's enslaved mistress was also his sister-in-law. Historians have debated whether it was a relationship or exploitation. But let's be real, Sally Hemings had no legal freedom. She was his property. No matter what their personal dynamic may have been, the power imbalance was absolute. And yet, Jefferson kept it all hidden. He never acknowledged the children publicly, but he did grant freedom to some of them and Sally later in life, which was rare at the time. Today, the Jefferson Hemings descendants hold reunions at Monticello. The truth has finally been accepted. But for decades, it was a buried scandal that no one in polite history circles wanted to talk about. It forces us to see Jefferson not as a marble statue, but as a deeply complicated man, capable of both world-changing ideas and serious hypocrisy. Now Jefferson was brilliant, but the next guy, not so much. James Madison was a political genius, but he was also tiny, sickly, and constantly overshadowed, even by his own wife. And his presidency, let's just say he kind of lost the White House. Stick around. James Madison, the invisible president with the star wife. James Madison may have helped design the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the foundations of American democracy. But when it came time to actually talk to people, he wanted to disappear. Madison was, without exaggeration, one of the most introverted and soft-spoken presidents in American history. He wasn't just quiet, he was awkward, shy, and deeply uncomfortable in the spotlight. This was a man who would rather draft 1,000 pages of policy than make one toast at a dinner party. But that's where his secret weapon came in. Her name was Dolly Madison, and she wasn't just the first lady. She was the face of the Madison administration. While James avoided eye contact and mumbled through his speeches, Dolly was hosting legendary social events in the White House, charming diplomats, and working rooms like a 19th century celebrity. People didn't come to Washington for the president, they came for Dolly's parties. She even had a nickname, Queen Dolly. And here's the thing, her influence wasn't just decorative. In an era where women couldn't vote or hold office, Dolly shaped public opinion, eased political tensions, and made her husband's presidency look far more functional than it really was. Madison, for all his brilliance, wasn't a people person. He struggled with small talk, preferred silence over speeches, and absolutely hated public confrontation. At formal events, he often lingered at the edge of the room, letting Dolly take over completely. Foreign dignitaries wrote letters raving about her, not him. Journalists covered her outfits and her guest lists. Even congressmen admitted that Dolly was the one who made Washington feel less like a swamp and more like a city. And when the War of 1812 hit and the British burned down the White House, it wasn't James who became the symbol of national resilience. It was Dolly, famously saving a portrait of George Washington before fleeing the flames. She was grace, charisma, and presence, all the things James Madison wasn't, and rather than compete with her, He quietly stepped back and let her lead in the areas where he couldn't. And honestly, that might have been his smartest political move. In a time when America needed visibility, personality, and poise, Madison gave them policy, and Dolly delivered the public face. Together they made a perfect political pairing, the ghostwriter president and the first real celebrity first lady. But the next president wouldn't need help with charm. James Monroe had the star power and the name recognition. What he didn't have was money. Let's talk about the president who went from Revolutionary War hero to dying flat broke. James Monroe, the president who died penniless. James Monroe was a Revolutionary War hero, a founding father, and a two-term president who shaped American foreign policy with the famous Monroe Doctrine, a bold statement that told Europe to back off the Western Hemisphere. You'd think a guy like that would live out his golden years in wealth and comfort, right? Not even close. Monroe died flat broke, as in couldn't pay his bills, had to move in with relatives, and spent his final years selling off furniture just to get by. But how does a man go from one of the most powerful figures in America to complete financial ruin? It turns out Monroe had a lifelong habit of spending like a king, even while earning like a public servant. During his many diplomatic missions, first as ambassador to France, then to Britain and Spain, he fronted massive expenses from his own pocket: lavish dinners, parties for foreign dignitaries, transportation, housing. He covered it all with the assumption that the US government would reimburse him. Spoiler, they didn't. Years later, he was still filing paperwork, begging Congress to pay him back. He even itemized decades-old travel costs and sent them to the Treasury. Some were paid, slowly, but most were ignored. And the kicker? Monroe never publicly complained. He was too proud. His presidency didn't help much either. Monroe insisted on traveling the country on his goodwill tour, which was great for morale, but brutal on his bank account. He lived large, maintained multiple estates, and refused to cut back on his lifestyle, even as debts piled up behind the scenes. By the time he left the White House, Monroe owed more money than he could ever repay. He tried to live modestly at first, but after his wife died and his health declined, he moved in with his daughter in New York City, where he quietly passed away in 1831. No estate, no inheritance, no statues being built, just silence. In the end, the man who told Europe to stay out of American affairs couldn't even afford a house of his own. His personal fortune vanished, his letters begged for reimbursement, and history mostly forgot how financially broken he was. But there's one eerie twist to his story. Monroe died on July 4th, just like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson before him. That's 3 founding fathers gone on the exact same day. Independence Day. Coincidence? Fate? Or something weirder? John Quincy Adams, the president who wanted to meet mole people. John Quincy Adams was a brilliant diplomat, fluent in multiple languages, and the son of a president. But underneath all that formality, he may have genuinely believed in mole people. Yeah, you heard that right. The 6th president of the United States, Harvard graduate, author of the Monroe Doctrine, and lifelong public servant, was also a supporter of the hollow earth theory. It's exactly what it sounds like. The belief that the earth isn't solid, but instead contains vast open spaces, possibly even entire civilizations living underneath us. Enter John Clive Sims Jr., a former Army officer who began publicly promoting the idea in the early 1800s. He claimed the Earth had huge openings at the poles, leading to an inner world filled with advanced life forms. Sims was mocked by most scientists, laughed at by the press, but not by John Quincy Adams. Adams, fascinated by scientific exploration and the idea of American discovery, didn't just take Sims seriously. He supported a full-scale government-funded expedition to find the entrance to the hollow earth. The plan? Send a team to the North Pole, locate the hole, and venture inside. Yes, on taxpayer dollars. Adams never got the chance to make it official. Before the expedition launched, he lost re-election to Andrew Jackson, who promptly shut the whole thing down. Jackson reportedly called the idea nonsense and cut off all support. But for a moment in history, the President of the United States was preparing to send American explorers on a journey to meet hypothetical underground civilizations. Some even say Adams believed they could be peaceful, intelligent beings, perhaps with knowledge beyond our own. Now, to be fair, Adams was also one of the most forward-thinking minds of his time. He fought against slavery, advocated for education, and served in Congress for years after his presidency. But his brief fascination with a giant polar hole filled with mole people, that's one of those facts history textbooks love to leave out. It's a reminder that even the smartest leaders can believe in some very strange things. But while Adams was dreaming of inner Earth diplomacy, his successor had no interest in hypothetical creatures. Andrew Jackson was all about action, and he proved it by literally beating down an assassin in the street with his cane. Let's talk about the president who turned into a one-man security detail. Andrew Jackson, the man who took a native child, then took their land. Andrew Jackson is one of the most controversial presidents in American history, a war hero, a populist, a president who reshaped the office and left behind a trail of devastation. But here's a fact that'll stop you in your tracks. During the Creek War, Jackson adopted a Native American boy. He raised him as his own son, and then just years later, he signed into law one of the most brutal policies in U.S. history, the Indian Removal Act, which led to the infamous Trail of Tears. So, what gives? The boy's name was Lincoln, a young Creek child found on a battlefield. Jackson reportedly discovered him beside his dead mother after a massacre, had ordered his troops not to harm the boy, saying, "He is worth more than any white child I know." He brought Lincoln home, raised him with his white sons, gave him an education, and even wanted him to attend West Point. It sounds compassionate until you look at the bigger picture, because while Jackson was adopting one native child, he was actively working to force thousands of others from their homes. As president, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, giving the federal government power to relocate native tribes west of the Mississippi. The result? Brutal forced marches, starvation, exposure, and death. Lincoln died young, before Jackson reached the presidency. But the contradiction remained. The man who showed tenderness to one native boy also set into motion the suffering of entire nations. Jackson saw no contradiction. In his mind, he believed he was saving the civilized few while removing the problem of native sovereignty. It was a twisted version of paternalism, and it had deadly consequences. This strange, haunting duality defined Jackson's legacy. He could be generous and violent, loyal and ruthless. The same man who killed a man in a duel over an insult also filled the White House with rowdy parties and fistfights. He survived the first assassination attempt on a U.S. president because the assassin's gun misfired twice. Jackson then beat the man nearly to death with his cane. He was a walking contradiction, and his legacy? Still fiercely debated today. But the man who followed him, Martin Van Buren, had his own strange place in presidential history. He was the first president born as an American citizen, not a British subject, and he didn't even speak English as his first language. Because Van Buren wasn't just from New York, he was from Dutch New York. Let's get into it. Martin Van Buren, the first American president who didn't speak English first. Martin Van Buren is one of those presidents people tend to forget. He's not on the money, there's no flashy war or scandal attached to his name, and his hair looked like it was constantly trying to escape his head. But here's a fact that puts Van Buren in a category all his own. He was the first president born as a U.S. citizen. Every president before him had been born under British rule. Van Buren, he was born in 1782 after the American Revolution. So he wasn't just from America, he was of America. But here's the twist. His first language wasn't English, it was Dutch. That's right. Martin Van Buren grew up in Kinderhook, New York, a town so rooted in Dutch culture that English wasn't even spoken in his home until later in his life. His parents were Dutch-American farmers, and young Martin spoke fluent Dutch into adulthood. In fact, he remains the only U.S. president whose first language wasn't English. Imagine that. America's first native-born president giving speeches with a Dutch accent. He didn't just talk differently, he thought differently. Van Buren's upbringing made him a political outsider in the polished Virginian elite of the early republic, and yet he worked his way to the top through pure strategy and social savvy. He became known as the Little Magician, not for any Hogwarts-level powers, but because of his ruthless behind-the-scenes political maneuvering. He built the foundations of the modern Democratic Party, pioneered political machines, and understood how to make power happen, even if he wasn't the one always holding it. And speaking of his influence, have you ever used the word okay? You know, as in, that's okay? Some historians trace that expression back to Van Buren's presidential campaign. His nickname, Old Kinderhook, was shortened to OK on buttons and posters. Supporters would say, "Vote for OK." Whether or not he really invented it, Van Buren definitely helped it spread. So the next time you text OK, just know you might be echoing the branding of an underrated Dutch-speaking political wizard. But all the political finesse in the world couldn't save Van Buren from what came next, because his successor, William Henry Harrison, was old, really old, at least by 1840 standards. His enemies called him Granny Harrison and mocked him as a relic of the past. But Harrison wasn't about to go quietly. He had a point to prove, and he brought the energy of a man half his age. And let's talk about the nearly 70-year-old who was determined to show America he still had fight in him. William Henry Harrison, Granny who charged into the White House. William Henry Harrison is best known for one thing: being president for exactly 31 days before dying in office. But before we get to that ending, you need to know about the beginning, because it's even crazier than the end. By the time Harrison ran for president in 1840, he was nearly 70 years old. That might sound normal today, but back then, that was ancient. Life expectancy was in the 40s. Most people his age were either dead or dying of something. His opponents didn't hold back. They called him Granny Harrison, mocking his age, his war stories, and his outdated ideals. They claimed he should retire to a log cabin, sip hard cider, and let younger men run the country. And you know what Harrison did? He leaned all the way in. He ran what's now known as the log cabin campaign, painting himself as a rugged, humble man of the people. Born in a log cabin, he wasn't. Surviving on hard cider, he didn't. It was brilliant marketing. Granny Harrison became frontier grandpa, and the country ate it up. He campaigned harder than candidates half his age. He gave speeches in the cold, shook thousands of hands, and made it his mission to prove he wasn't too old for the job. His catchphrase, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, a nod to his war hero past and his running mate, John Tyler. When Harrison won, he became the oldest president elected at the time, and he made a huge show of it. At his inauguration, Harrison refused to wear a coat or hat, even though it was freezing and windy. He wanted to show strength, defy the granny image, and prove his vitality. It was performative, it was bold, and yeah, it was risky. But contrary to popular myth, it wasn't that speech or the weather that killed him. Modern historians now believe Harrison got sick weeks later, likely from contaminated water in the White House plumbing, not from the cold and not from the speech. Still, it didn't help. And just like that, 31 days later, he was gone. The first president to die in office, the shortest presidency in American history. But make no mistake, William Henry Harrison didn't go down as a frail old man. He went down swinging, full of spite and energy, determined to prove the country wrong about him. And when he died, the presidency passed to the man who was never supposed to be president, John Tyler, a man so unpopular, his own party kicked him out while he was still in office. Let's get into that mess next. John Tyler, the president without a party. You've probably never heard of John Tyler unless you're a hardcore presidential trivia nerd. But this guy holds one of the most awkward records in American political history. He's the only U.S. president to be kicked out of his own political party while still in office. Seriously, the Whig Party, which helped elect him, expelled him. And they didn't even try to hide it. Let's rewind. Tyler wasn't elected president. He was vice president under William Henry Harrison. When Harrison died just 31 days into his term, Tyler became the first VP to take over midterm. Nobody was sure what to call him. Was he still just acting president? Should he serve out the full term? Tyler didn't wait for clarification. He moved into the White House, declared himself fully president, and demanded everyone treat him as such. Bold move, and the first sign of trouble. See, Tyler was a Whig in name, but not in values. He had more in common with Southern Democrats, and the moment he started vetoing Whig-backed legislation, especially their plans for a national bank, he set off a political earthquake. Whig leaders were furious. Congressmen started calling him his accidency. His entire cabinet resigned in protest, and then the Whig Party did something no other party has done before or since. They officially expelled him. Imagine that. You are president of the United States, and your own party sends you a breakup letter. They even refused to nominate him for a second term. It got worse. Tyler tried to form his own political faction and run for re-election, but no one took it seriously. He became a political orphan, unwelcome at Whig events, ignored by Democrats, and basically left to govern with no allies. He did, however, manage one major achievement, annexing Texas, but even that stirred massive controversy and tensions over slavery, which eventually exploded into the Civil War. And here's the kicker. When Tyler died in 1862, he was serving in the Confederate Congress. He's the only U.S. president to be buried under a foreign flag, that of the Confederacy. The U.S. government didn't even acknowledge his death at the time. From president to partyless to traitor, depending on who you ask, John Tyler's story isn't just forgotten. It's almost erased. James K. Polk, the president who worked himself to death. Some presidents treat the job like a performance. James K. Polk treated it like a military campaign, with himself as the lone soldier, general, and supply line all in one. He made a promise when he took office in 1845. He would serve only one term and accomplish exactly 4 goals. He wasn't there to shake hands or enjoy the perks. He came to get things done, and he did, all of them. Polk annexed Texas, negotiated the Oregon Territory dispute with Britain, lowered tariffs, and launched a war with Mexico, which led to the U.S. acquiring California, Arizona, New Mexico, and more. Basically, he reshaped the entire map of the United States in 4 years. But here's the crazy part. He didn't delegate much of this. Polk was a micromanager to the extreme. He worked 12 to 14-hour days, read every document himself, reviewed every military dispatch, and tracked every bill in Congress. He refused to take vacations. He barely slept. He kept a daily diary just to hold himself accountable. And when his time was up, he kept his word. He didn't run again. He walked away from the presidency at the height of his power, which very few leaders ever do. But Polk left the White House in 1849 as a hollowed-out man. He was only 53, but years of stress, exhaustion, and obsession had drained him. Just 3 months after leaving office, James K. Polk was dead. The cause? Cholera officially, but most historians agree his immune system was so wrecked from constant overwork that his body couldn't fight even a fairly common illness. He literally worked himself into the grave. And to this day, no president before or since has jammed so much expansion, negotiation, and legislation into a single term. It was like 4 presidencies crammed into 4 years. And he did it on caffeine, willpower, and pure obsession. Polk's presidency expanded America's borders by nearly 1/3, but at the cost of his own health and life. A man who believed in results over relaxation and paid the ultimate price for it. And while Polk was dying from burnout, the man who followed him, Zachary Taylor, barely even believed in voting. He was a war hero who thought elections were for civilians, until he voted for himself. Let's revisit the general who broke his own rule just in time to become president. Zachary Taylor, the president who didn't trust voting until he needed it. Zachary Taylor didn't care much for politics. In fact, until the day he ran for president, he had never even voted in a presidential election, not once. And it wasn't because he was lazy, or uninformed, or indifferent. It was because he didn't believe military officers should vote. Let that sink in. One of the most powerful men to ever lead the United States spent his life actively avoiding the ballot box because he thought it would compromise his duty as a soldier. Taylor was a career general, a battlefield legend. He earned the nickname Old Rough and Ready for leading troops through the brutal heat and mud of the Mexican-American War. He wasn't polished. He wasn't a speech giver. He was the kind of guy who wore the same dusty uniform every day and ate the same rations as his men. And politics? That was for civilians. He believed that officers should stay neutral, loyal only to the Constitution and their mission. Getting involved in elections? That felt dangerously close to partisanship, something he feared could erode military discipline and public trust. So for decades, Taylor didn't vote, not even for his friends, not even when big issues were on the line. He stayed out of it. That is, until 1848, when the Whig Party tapped him as their presidential nominee. Suddenly, the man who had never pulled a lever was being asked to run the entire country. And to Taylor's credit, even then, he hesitated. He didn't know the party's platform. He wasn't sure he could win. He wasn't even entirely sure what the president did. But people loved him. He was a war hero, a symbol of strength, independence, and honesty. The Whigs wanted someone untainted by Washington, and Taylor fit the bill. So he agreed. And in 1848, he cast his very first vote for himself. It was the first and only time he ever voted in a presidential election. Once in office, Taylor stayed true to form, independent, unpredictable, and blunt. He clashed with Congress, refused to bend to party leaders, and took bold stances, particularly against the expansion of slavery into new territories. But just 16 months into his presidency, Taylor suddenly fell ill after attending a July 4th celebration. He died days later under suspicious circumstances, fueling conspiracy theories that linger to this day. His presidency was short, but unforgettable, and ironic in every way. A man who refused to vote became the face of a nation. And after his sudden death, the presidency fell to Millard Fillmore, a man who accepted power quietly, and later turned down one of the fanciest honors on earth, simply because it was written in Latin. Let's get into that. Millard Fillmore, the president who said no thanks to Oxford. Millard Fillmore doesn't exactly light up history books. He's often remembered, if at all, as the guy who slipped into the presidency after Zachary Taylor died. No major wars, no big scandals, just kind of there. But hidden behind that forgettable image is a guy with a surprising streak of pettiness and principle. Because when Oxford University, yes, that Oxford, offered him an honorary degree, Millard Fillmore refused it. Why? Because the degree was written in Latin, and he thought that was pretentious. Seriously. Now, to be fair, Fillmore wasn't anti-intellectual. He had worked his way up from poverty, studied law on his own, and helped found the university at Buffalo. He believed in education, hard work, and practicality. What he didn't believe in was what he called pompous displays of false erudition. So when Oxford offered him an honorary Doctor of Civil Law degree, Fillmore responded by declining it on the grounds that he couldn't read the diploma, and that giving someone a title in a language they didn't understand was, in his words, a literary charade. Imagine being offered a prestigious international honor and sending it back like, nope, if it ain't in English, I'm not impressed. It was peak Fillmore, understated, stubborn, and kind of salty. But that moment also reveals something deeper about the man. Fillmore spent his life trying to prove himself. Born dirt poor, apprenticed to a clothmaker, and largely self-educated, he rose to the highest office in the land without the elite connections most of his predecessors had. To him, the Oxford degree wasn't a badge of honor. It was a reminder of the elite world that had always looked down on him. Latin, that was the language of privilege, and Fillmore had no interest in playing along. As president, he approached governing the same way. He avoided extremes, tried to hold the Union together with compromise, and stayed out of the spotlight as much as possible. Some historians call him bland. Others say he was the last president who really tried to keep the North and South from tearing each other apart. Either way, he was a man who believed in simplicity, humility, and English-only diplomas. But the next guy, he had no problem being dramatic. Franklin Pierce once got arrested while in office for running someone over with his horse. No, really. Let's talk about the president who couldn't even walk through Washington without a legal incident. Franklin Pierce, the president who was arrested for a hit and run on horseback. Franklin Pierce might be one of the least remembered presidents, but his time in office was filled with chaos, personal tragedy, and at least one bizarre legal scandal that sounds like something out of a political cartoon. Because while serving as president of the United States, Franklin Pierce was arrested for allegedly running over an old woman with his horse. Let's rewind. It's Washington, D.C., mid-1850s. Pierce, known for his love of alcohol and frequent solo rides around the Capitol, was spotted galloping through the streets, not trotting, galloping. Back then, there weren't motorcades or black SUVs, just open roads, a few pedestrians, and a very confident man on a horse. And then, allegedly, a collision. According to reports, Pierce struck an elderly woman with his horse. Witnesses claimed she was knocked down and injured. Police actually arrested the sitting president, an almost unthinkable scenario today. Imagine the Secret Service standing by while the commander-in-chief is taken in for a hit and run. But here's where it gets murky. The charges were quietly dropped due to what authorities called insufficient evidence. No press conference, no trial, just vanished. Some historians think the case was buried to avoid national embarrassment. Others suspect the woman either recovered quickly or was too afraid to press charges. Pierce, for his part, never commented publicly, and neither did the White House. And honestly, it fits. Franklin Pierce's presidency was a storm of bad decisions, personal grief, and political disasters. He lost all three of his children, one of them in a train crash just weeks before his inauguration. His wife never recovered, and Pierce coped the only way he knew how. He drank a lot. He was known to disappear for days, possibly on benders. Even political allies called him melancholy and detached. And when it came to leadership, he was widely seen as weak, especially on the issue of slavery. His support of the Kansas-Nebraska Act helped stoke the fire that would soon ignite the Civil War. But somehow the image that sticks is this: a brooding president riding alone through the muddy streets of Washington, possibly drunk, getting arrested for nearly flattening an old lady. It's the kind of story that makes you wonder how much chaos used to be brushed under the rug before smartphones. And if you think that's strange, wait until you meet his successor. James Buchanan, the only lifelong bachelor president, once bought slaves in Washington, D.C., not to own them, but to secretly free them. And let's dig into one of the most puzzling figures in presidential history. James Buchanan, the president who secretly bought slaves to set them free. James Buchanan is often remembered, fairly or not, as the president who let the country fall apart. He left office just before the Civil War erupted, and most historians rank him near the bottom of the list. But hidden in the shadow of his controversial presidency is a fact that doesn't quite fit the image of a do-nothing leader. James Buchanan once bought slaves in Washington, D.C., not to keep them, but to free them in Pennsylvania. Yeah, that really happened. Buchanan was a Pennsylvanian through and through, a Northern Democrat, a man who never married, and lived with another man for over a decade, a personal life that has sparked speculation ever since. But while his public stance on slavery was maddeningly passive, his private actions were complicated. He had deep ties to Southern interests and often argued for compromise to keep the Union intact, even if that meant allowing slavery to continue. But at some point, Buchanan began quietly purchasing enslaved individuals in the nation's capital, not to put them to work, but to take them north and set them free. He never bragged about it. He never made it a political statement. In fact, the few records we have suggest he kept these actions deliberately low profile. It was the kind of thing that, if it had come out, might have angered both the pro-slavery South and the increasingly abolitionist North. So why do it? Historians can only speculate. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was his conscience. Or maybe Buchanan, who was raised in a state where slavery had been abolished, simply couldn't stomach the reality of it up close. Whatever the reason, it paints a strange picture. A president whose personal values may have been far more anti-slavery than his public policies ever showed. A man caught between his political alliances and his private morality. But it also underscores Buchanan's central flaw. He didn't act decisively when it counted. Quietly freeing a few people while the nation hurtled toward war wasn't enough. And when the South seceded, Buchanan basically threw up his hands and said, "Not my job." He believed the Constitution didn't allow secession, but also that it didn't let him stop it. He watched the house burn, then passed the bucket to the next guy. And that next guy, he wasn't just ready to act. He was nearly killed before even reaching the White House. Abraham Lincoln survived more than one assassination attempt before becoming president. One of them, a bullet that passed clean through his hat. Let's talk about the man who dodged death and then changed history. Here's the full segment for Abraham Lincoln based on the updated fact. He was nearly killed twice before becoming president. Once in a duel, and another time when a would-be assassin shot through his hat. The tone stays cinematic and grounded in curiosity, ending with a strong hook into Ulysses S. Grant. Abraham Lincoln, the president who dodged death twice. Before Abraham Lincoln became the great emancipator, before Gettysburg, before the Civil War, before that fateful night at Ford's Theater, he almost didn't live long enough to make it to the presidency at all. Why? Because Lincoln had a strange, almost supernatural relationship with death. And long before he took the oath of office, he'd already narrowly survived 2 assassination attempts. Let's start with the one that sounds like something out of a Wild West movie. In his younger years, Lincoln was challenged to a duel. And not just any duel. This one involved swords. The cause? a brutal war of words between Lincoln and a powerful political rival's wife. Lincoln, always sharp with the pen, wrote a series of biting satirical letters under a fake name. His target, a political opponent named James Shields. Shields was not amused. He demanded satisfaction. Now here's where Lincoln got clever. As the challenged party, Lincoln got to choose the weapons. Instead of pistols, he picked broadswords, and then showed up at the dueling grounds with an absurdly long reach advantage. He reportedly even chopped down a tree branch to demonstrate just how far he could swing. The fight never happened. Shields realized the mismatch and called it off, but Lincoln came this close to dying over a satirical letter. Fast forward to 1864. Lincoln is now running for re-election, and the country is deep in civil war. One night, while riding alone near the soldiers' home in Washington, his usual presidential retreat, he hears a gunshot. A bullet tears through the air and blasts clean through his hat. A farmer later found the top hat with a bullet hole in it. Lincoln brushed it off as a warning. He even joked that it wasn't the first time someone wanted to take a little off the top, but everyone around him was shaken. Someone had fired at the President of the United States and missed by inches. Lincoln, known for his prophetic dreams and eerie premonitions, took the near miss in stride. But looking back, it feels like the universe was already preparing him for the ending we all know. 2 close calls, 2 different decades. And yet Lincoln pressed on. Into war, into history, into legend. But when the bullet finally found him, it wasn't in battle. It was at a theater. And the man who stepped into his shoes? He wasn't ready. Not politically, not emotionally, and definitely not publicly. Because just weeks earlier, Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's new vice president, stood on stage at his own inauguration, slurring his words, naming names, and possibly drunk. Let's talk about the president who embarrassed himself before he even took office. Andrew Johnson, the vice president who might have been drunk at his own inauguration. When you think about political disasters, a few names probably come to mind. But if you're looking for a meltdown that happened live, on the biggest stage in the country, in front of Congress, diplomats, and press, it's hard to beat Andrew Johnson's vice presidential inauguration. And yes, there's a very real chance he was drunk. The date was March 4th, 1865, just weeks before the end of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was being sworn in for his second term. Andrew Johnson, his new vice president, had just replaced Hannibal Hamlin on the ticket. It was supposed to be a symbolic moment of unity. Lincoln the Northerner, Johnson the Southern Democrat, loyal to the Union. What they got instead was a rambling, sweaty, unhinged speech that people still talk about today. Johnson took the stage visibly ill. He claimed to be recovering from typhoid fever. He slurred his words, shouted at the crowd, and at one point began naming individual members of Lincoln's cabinet, declaring loudly that they should remember they are but servants of the people. Lincoln, sitting nearby, was reportedly horrified. According to witnesses, Johnson downed multiple glasses of whiskey before the ceremony, either to calm his nerves or help with his fever. Either way, the result was chaos. He had to be gently pulled away from the podium before he could embarrass himself and the country any further. The press roasted him. Senators and ambassadors whispered about his disgraceful condition. One paper called the speech the beginning of a national embarrassment, and this was before he even became president. When Lincoln was assassinated just weeks later, Johnson suddenly found himself in charge of a broken country, with zero trust from the people who had just watched him slur his way through an oath. It didn't get better from there. Johnson's presidency was marked by angry vetoes, constant clashes with Congress, and the first ever presidential impeachment. He survived by just 1 vote. But that inauguration? That was the warning shot. The moment the country realized the man who would replace Lincoln might be wildly out of his depth, or just wild in general. And while Johnson was sweating through speeches and alienating the government, his successor, Ulysses S. Grant, was making very different waves. He won the war, led with grit, and once got so drunk at a state dinner, he toasted the wrong country. Let's talk about how one of the most respected generals in U.S. history still had very human slip-ups. Ulysses S. Grant, the war hero who toasted the wrong country. Ulysses S. Grant was the Union's iron fist, the general who crushed the Confederacy and brought the Civil War to a brutal, decisive end. When he became president in 1869, The country expected a man of discipline, integrity, and control. But control? That wasn't always his strong suit, especially when it came to alcohol. Grant's drinking was a well-known issue, even during the war. His staff kept it quiet, but everyone in Washington whispered about it. He was said to go dry for long periods, then fall off the wagon, sometimes spectacularly. And one of the most infamous examples came during a formal state dinner. The story goes like this. Grant was hosting a foreign delegation, diplomats, generals, ambassadors, the usual DC crowd. The wine was flowing, the silverware shining, and Grant, trying to keep things light and friendly, rose for a toast. But somewhere between sips and speeches, he got confused. Instead of toasting the visiting country's head of state, he raised his glass to an entirely different nation. A diplomatic misstep so glaring that guests froze mid-chew. The foreign dignitaries were not amused. Some accounts say his aides scrambled to smooth it over, offering clarification in hushed tones. Others say Grant just laughed it off. Either way, the press caught wind and the story spread like wildfire. Now, this wasn't a scandal on the level of treason, but in the stiff, etiquette-heavy world of 19th century diplomacy, it was a major faux pas. And it fed into the growing perception that Grant, while a military genius, was out of his depth in politics. And to be fair, he kind of was. Grant's presidency was riddled with corruption scandals, not because he was corrupt, but because he was too trusting. He brought in old war buddies, gave them positions of power, and failed to notice or stop the greed spreading behind his back. But through it all, he remained personally honest, deeply loyal, and painfully human. And despite the toasts, the hangovers, and the headlines, Grant left office as one of the most respected men in the country. He even went bankrupt later in life and wrote his memoirs while dying of cancer, just to support his family. A flawed hero, a quiet fighter, and a man who once raised a glass for peace to the wrong flag. Rutherford B. Hayes, the president who had a phone and didn't use it. Rutherford B. Hayes wasn't exactly known for charisma, or chaos, or even controversy, unless you count the 1876 election, which was so bitterly contested. It had to be settled by a special commission in secret backrooms. But once he got into the White House, Hayes did something no president had done before. He installed a telephone. It was 1877, and Alexander Graham Bell had just made his groundbreaking invention. Most Americans had never seen a phone, let alone touched one. Hayes, curious about technology, had one installed in the White House telegraph room with the first number ever assigned. 1. Seriously. His phone number was literally 1. You'd think that would be a huge deal. A new era of communication for the presidency. A direct line to the nation. But here's the kicker. Hayes almost never used it. Not because he was too busy, not because it didn't work, but because there was barely anyone else to call. The phone system was in its infancy. There was only one other phone connected to the White House line at the Department of the Treasury just down the street. It's like installing the world's first email server and having one contact. When Hayes did use it, he reportedly shouted into the receiver because the sound quality was so bad. He found the whole experience awkward and frustrating. So the first telephone in presidential history ended up being more of a conversation piece than a communication tool. And that sums up Hayes in a way. He was forward-thinking. He supported civil service reform, education for freed slaves, and even early ideas of racial equality. But he was also a man caught between old-school politics and new technology, tiptoeing toward progress, but unsure how far to leap. Even with electricity and phones arriving in the Gilded Age, Hayes preferred handwritten letters and face-to-face diplomacy. His presidency was the bridge between 19th century tradition and 20th century innovation, and he treated the telephone like a novelty, not a revolution. Still, he gets credit for picking up the receiver first. The very first voice call to the White House happened on his watch, and the man who came after Hayes, he didn't bother with gadgets. He was too busy calculating mathematical proofs for fun and writing speeches in Latin and Greek simultaneously. Let's talk about James A. Garfield, the math whiz who brought brainpower to the presidency and paid the price for it. James A. Garfield, the math nerd president who could prove the Pythagorean theorem for fun. James A. Garfield wasn't supposed to be president. He didn't seek the nomination. He gave a speech at the Republican convention and somehow walked out as the party's nominee. That's the kind of political accident that could produce a forgettable president. But Garfield was anything but forgettable, because this guy had a brain that didn't quit. Before he was president, before he was even a politician, Garfield was a college professor and a serious math and science nerd. He loved astronomy, classical languages, and logic puzzles. He once wrote Latin with one hand and Greek with the other at the same time, just to show he could. But his favorite flex? Proving the Pythagorean theorem, multiple ways, from scratch, as a party trick. You know the one. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Most of us barely survive it in high school geometry. Garfield, he came up with his own proof, an original method, combining triangles and trapezoids, and even published it in a mathematical journal while serving in Congress. It's the only time in U.S. history that a sitting member of Congress published an original mathematical proof, and it wasn't even a big deal to him, just something he liked doing in his spare time. This wasn't just show-off behavior. Garfield believed that knowledge was power, not in the vague political sense, but in the purest academic sense. He read constantly. He taught himself languages. He carried scientific journals on the campaign trail. He even helped fund telescopes and universities while he was in office. And here's the thing. Garfield had all the potential to be a truly transformational president. He fought corruption, believed in civil rights, and actually challenged the political machine that had dominated the Republican Party. He was the rare leader who was both a thinker and a fighter, but he barely had the chance to lead. Just 4 months into his term, Garfield was shot in a Washington train station by a disgruntled office seeker. The bullet didn't kill him immediately, but 80 days of primitive medical treatment did. Doctors probed the wound with unwashed hands, refused to listen to emerging germ theory, and ignored advice from experts like Alexander Graham Bell, who tried to locate the bullet with a homemade metal detector. In the end, Garfield, a man capable of proving complex theorems in his sleep, was undone by bad science. He died at just 49 years old, and his successor, Chester A. Arthur, would quietly erase most of Garfield's cabinet and burn nearly every trace of his own personal history before he died. Let's talk about the president who deleted himself from history. Chester A. Arthur, the president who deleted himself from history. If you ever tried to Google Chester A. Arthur and came up with almost nothing interesting, there's a reason for that. He made sure of it. Arthur may not be a household name, but he pulled off something no other president has. He erased himself from history on purpose. In the final days of his life, he burned nearly all of his personal papers, letters, journals, notes, gone. He left behind only the official government records and a handful of dry documents. Everything else vanished in a fireplace. So, who does that? And why? Let's rewind. Arthur wasn't supposed to be president. He was vice president under James A. Garfield, a flashy party insider best known for his mutton chops and fancy suits. He was a product of New York's powerful political machine, the very kind of insider politics Garfield had tried to dismantle. When Garfield was assassinated, people feared the worst. Arthur was viewed as corrupt, lazy, and unqualified. The New York Times even wrote that his presidency would be a national calamity. But then, he surprised everyone. Arthur pushed through civil service reform, the exact kind of anti-corruption policy that his political backers hated. He stood up to his old allies. He vetoed wasteful spending. He started acting like a president with a conscience. He turned out to be better than anyone expected, and maybe that's why, when his health began to fail, Arthur decided to disappear. He was diagnosed with Bright's disease, a kidney condition he kept secret from the public. He knew the end was coming, and so, in a quiet, calculated move, he gathered his private correspondence, personal reflections, and unpublished records, and destroyed them all. He didn't want biographers digging through his thoughts. He didn't want historians rewriting his story. He wanted to control what the world remembered, and more importantly, what it didn't. What's left of Chester A. Arthur is an outline, a man who rose from scandal, governed with unexpected dignity, and then vanished like a ghost. He's the president with the cleanest digital footprint because he burned the hard drive. But his successor, he didn't hide from the spotlight. In fact, Grover Cleveland faced one of the most shocking presidential health crises of all time and tried to cover it up with a yacht, a fake fishing trip, and some clever surgery. Let's talk about the president who had cancer surgery at sea and thought no one would notice. Grover Cleveland, the president who had secret cancer surgery at sea. Grover Cleveland is the only U.S. president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, making him both the 22nd and 24th president. But even more bizarre than his interrupted presidency is what happened between those terms, when he risked everything to hide a terrifying secret from the American public. In 1893, during his second term, Cleveland discovered a tumor in the roof of his mouth. His doctors were blunt. It looked like oral cancer. It was aggressive. And if the public found out, it could trigger economic panic, because the country was already spiraling into a major depression. So Cleveland did what no other president had ever done. He planned a secret surgery on a yacht. That summer, he vanished from the public eye, claiming he was going on a short fishing trip aboard a friend's boat, the Oneida. What really happened was something straight out of a political thriller. The ship's salon was transformed into an operating room. The presidential medical team boarded the yacht in disguise. Cleveland was placed under anesthesia, and surgeons cut through the roof of his mouth, removed the tumor, 5 teeth, and part of his upper jaw, all while at sea. The crew was sworn to secrecy. The yacht was chosen specifically to avoid press and prying eyes. The surgery lasted about 90 minutes. Cleveland's face was swollen for days, and he had difficulty speaking when he returned. To the public, he told them he just had 2 bad teeth pulled. Incredibly, the plan worked. The media didn't catch on, at least not right away. It wasn't until 1917, nearly 25 years later, that one of the surgeons finally revealed the full truth. By then, Cleveland was long gone, and the public reaction was somewhere between shock and disbelief. Think about that. A sitting president underwent major cancer surgery on a boat in the middle of an economic crisis, and nobody knew. It was one of the boldest cover-ups in presidential history, and for decades, it remained hidden beneath the waves of history. Cleveland survived the surgery, finished his term, and left office quietly. But his legacy? Forever marked by the day he let a surgical team take a saw to his skull on the high seas. The next man to take office, Benjamin Harrison, wasn't much for drama, but he did have one claim to fame. He was the first president whose voice was ever recorded. And yeah, we still have the crackly audio to prove it. Let's turn up the static and step into the era of electricity and Edison. Benjamin Harrison, the first president you can actually hear. Benjamin Harrison doesn't usually top lists of memorable presidents. He was soft-spoken, serious, and famously short, only 5 feet 6 inches. So short, in fact, that they had to build him a custom podium so he could be seen over the crowd. But here's the crazy part. He might have had a small presence, but he made a massive leap in presidential history. Literally into the sound era. Benjamin Harrison was the first U.S. president to have his voice recorded. The year was 1889, and Thomas Edison's phonograph had just started making waves. It was still a new and glitchy machine, big, boxy, and operated with wax cylinders. But the idea of preserving human speech was revolutionary. So, when Harrison gave a speech at the first Pan American Congress, Edison's team set up a phonograph and hit record. And that's how we got it, the first surviving audio of a U.S. president's voice. The recording is only about 12 seconds long, and honestly, it's kind of a mess. Harrison's voice is buried under static. The words are hard to make out. It sounds like a distant ghost trapped in a tin can, but that doesn't make it any less amazing. Because for the first time, you didn't have to just read what the president said, you could hear him say it. It marked the beginning of a new kind of political legacy, one no longer limited to ink and paper. After Harrison, presidents would be photographed, recorded, filmed, and eventually broadcast live to the world. But he was the first, the quiet man who brought sound to the presidency. And that wasn't the only forward-thinking move on his resume. Harrison also had the White House wired for electricity. Though he and his wife were too scared to touch the light switches, they reportedly left lamps burning all night because they didn't want to flip them off. So yes, Benjamin Harrison brought in the modern era, but very, very cautiously. And when he left office, the country turned to a man with a much louder reputation. William McKinley, a president with battlefield scars, bold convictions, and one very superstitious habit. He wore good luck charms sewn into his clothes, including a red carnation he always kept on his lapel, until the day he gave it away. Let's talk about the flower that may have sealed McKinley's fate. William McKinley, the president who gave away his good luck and got shot. William McKinley was calm, calculated, and always in control. He was the kind of president who wore suits so crisp they looked ironed by angels and gave speeches so measured they could have been printed in textbooks. But behind that buttoned-up demeanor was a man who believed deeply in luck, especially in one very specific charm, a red carnation. McKinley wore one almost every day, usually pinned to his lapel. It became his signature accessory, bright, bold, and always present. Friends, staff, even the press began to associate the flower with him. What they didn't know was that McKinley believed it was more than just decoration. He believed it was protecting him. McKinley was famously superstitious. In addition to the flower, he was rumored to keep small tokens sewn into his clothing for luck. Coins, notes, even bits of ribbon. But it was the red carnation that became his personal talisman. And on September 6th, 1901, during a public reception at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, McKinley greeted a long line of supporters, shaking hands, smiling, keeping up appearances, until a young girl came up to meet him. McKinley smiled and removed the red carnation from his lapel. He bent down and handed it to her. Moments later, the next man in line stepped forward. He wasn't holding out his hand. He was hiding a gun beneath a handkerchief. Bang, bang. McKinley was shot twice in the abdomen. At first, he seemed like he might recover, but days later, infection set in. The good luck charm was gone, and 8 days after the shooting, he died, becoming the third U.S. president to be assassinated. Now, was it coincidence? Of course, it could have happened with or without the flower, but in the minds of many, giving away that red carnation was the moment his luck and life ran out. His death shook the nation. But what came next shook it even more, because the man who took his place was unlike anything the White House had ever seen. Theodore Roosevelt didn't just walk into the presidency. He charged in, a cowboy, a soldier, a boxer, and once he gave a full campaign speech after being shot in the chest. Let's talk about the man who looked at a bullet wound and said, "I'll just talk through it." Theodore Roosevelt, the president who took a bullet and kept talking. Some presidents give speeches. Theodore Roosevelt gave battle cries. He was a cowboy, a soldier, a boxer, a hunter, a historian, and once a guy who got shot in the chest and then said, "Hold my speech." Let's rewind to October 14th, 1912. Roosevelt was running for president again as the head of the newly formed Progressive Party, better known as the Bull Moose Party. He was campaigning hard, giving fiery speeches across the country and shaking things up with his usual bare-knuckle style. That evening in Milwaukee, Roosevelt stepped out of his hotel to address a crowd. But as he stood beside his car, a man pushed through the crowd, pulled out a revolver, and shot Roosevelt at close range, right in the chest. Here's where the story turns insane. The bullet tore through Roosevelt's steel eyeglass case and 50-page folded speech tucked in his coat pocket. Those two items slowed the bullet just enough that it didn't hit anything vital. Blood was soaking through his shirt. But Roosevelt stayed on his feet. And then, he insisted on giving the speech anyway. He stood before a stunned audience, opened with the now legendary line, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." And then he spoke for 90 minutes. 90 minutes. No teleprompter. No paramedics on standby. Just Roosevelt, bleeding through his vest, delivering political fire to a silent, wide-eyed crowd. He didn't collapse. He didn't panic. He didn't stop until he was done. Only afterward did he go to the hospital, where doctors discovered the bullet had lodged in his chest muscle, just an inch from his lung. They decided it was safer to leave it in. Roosevelt carried that bullet inside him for the rest of his life. That speech wasn't just a political stunt. It was Roosevelt in a nutshell. Fearless, theatrical, and unstoppable. He wasn't a man of half measures. Whether charging up San Juan Hill or breaking up corporate monopolies, he did everything with the volume turned up to 11. And when he finally handed off the presidency to his close friend and hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, he expected the same energy. What he got was a man who got stuck in a bathtub. But before you laugh, Taft had a few traditions of his own, like starting the ceremonial first pitch in baseball, a presidential ritual that still lives on today. Let's talk about the biggest, roundest, most unexpectedly influential president in American sports history. William H. Taft, the big president who made baseball presidential. When people hear the name William Howard Taft, they usually picture one thing: a giant man stuck in a White House bathtub. But while that may be true, or at least partially true, it overshadows something far more lasting. Taft was the first president to throw out a ceremonial first pitch at a Major League Baseball game. And that simple toss, it kicked off a tradition that's lasted for over a century. It happened on April 14th, 1910, in Washington, D.C., at a game between the Washington Senators and the Philadelphia Athletics. Taft, a lifelong baseball fan, showed up to the ballpark with minimal security and a huge smile. He was the sitting president, and the crowd gave him a hero's welcome. When the teams lined up, Taft stood, took the baseball, and lobbed a soft toss from his seat in the stands down to the pitcher. Boom. A new presidential tradition was born. Since then, almost every U.S. president has followed in his footsteps, from FDR to Obama to Biden. Some nailed it, some bounced it. Some looked like they hadn't touched a baseball since Little League, but they all have Taft to thank. And honestly, it fits. Taft was a man of routines, rituals, and quiet pride. He wasn't loud like Teddy Roosevelt. He didn't crave attention. He preferred law, order, and a good game. After all, he later became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, still the only person in U.S. history to lead both the executive and judicial branches. But during his presidency, the baseball pitch was just one way he tried to connect with the people. He also believed in presidential leisure, not in a lazy way, but as a means of balance. He didn't see the presidency as a 24/7 spotlight. He saw it as a job to do well, then step away from. That's why the image of him tossing that first pitch still feels so human. For a moment, he wasn't commander-in-chief. He was just another fan in the stands, watching America's pastime unfold under the sun. And the man who came after him, Woodrow Wilson, didn't care about baseball traditions or ceremonial pitches. He came to the White House with one thing in mind: power. And he used it to segregate the federal government, turning back decades of progress with a few quiet orders. And let's talk about the academic who turned the government into a divided institution, on purpose. Woodrow Wilson, the professor who resegregated America's government. Woodrow Wilson came into office with the polished confidence of a college professor, which he literally was. He had been president of Princeton University, a brilliant speaker, and a man who believed in rules, order, and structure. He also believed in racial segregation, and as president, he didn't just tolerate it, he enforced it. When Wilson entered the White House in 1913, the federal government was one of the few places where Black and white Americans worked side by side, especially in departments like the Treasury and the Post Office. Black clerks, messengers, and administrators had held those positions for decades, often under Republican administrations that, while far from perfect, had at least preserved integration. Wilson changed that. Almost immediately, his administration began implementing segregationist policies. Bathrooms, cafeterias, and office spaces were physically separated by race. Photographs were required to accompany job applications so that Black applicants could be identified and rejected. Many Black federal workers were demoted, reassigned to menial positions, or fired altogether. And Wilson didn't just allow it, he defended it. When civil rights leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois protested, Wilson doubled down, claiming segregation was a benefit to both races and helped avoid friction. That's the part of Wilson's presidency that rarely shows up in textbooks. He's often remembered for leading America through World War I, proposing the League of Nations, and delivering high-minded speeches about democracy and self-determination. But those ideals, they didn't apply to Black Americans under his leadership, and the contradiction ran deep. This was the same president who hosted a screening of The Birth of a Nation, a film that glorified the Ku Klux Klan inside the White House. It was the first movie ever shown there. Wilson allegedly called it history written with lightning. Whether or not he actually said it, the message was clear. For all his intelligence and idealism, Wilson used the power of the presidency to roll back racial progress in ways that would ripple for decades. He wasn't just a product of his time, he was an architect of its worst instincts. And when he finally left office, sick and broken after a debilitating stroke, America was exhausted and ready for a president who looked like a regular guy. That man was Warren G. Harding. He played poker, loved a good scandal, and once gambled away an entire set of White House china. Let's talk about the man who brought back room politics to the center of the Oval Office. Warren G. Harding, the president who wrote love letters in the Oval Office. Warren G. Harding had the look of a president, tall, polished, perfectly parted hair, and he ran on a promise of returning to normalcy after World War I. But behind that reassuring image was one of the most scandal-ridden personal lives in presidential history, including a long-running affair with a much younger woman and a secret child. Her name was Nan Britton, a young woman from Harding's hometown in Ohio. She was just 20 when the affair began. Harding was in his 50s and already married. Nan idolized him. He called her sweetheart. She called him Papa. And their relationship wasn't some one-time tryst. It lasted years, including the entirety of his presidency. And it didn't happen in secret hideaways either. Harding and Britton met inside the White House, often in a small coat closet off the Oval Office, where they'd have clandestine encounters between meetings. Nan eventually gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth Ann, and claimed Harding was the father. At the time, no one believed her. She was humiliated, dismissed, even sued for libel when she published a tell-all book in 1927 titled The President's Daughter. It included excerpts from Harding's love letters, filled with affection, lust, and a few creative metaphors. The public was scandalized. The Harding family denied everything. Historians largely ignored it until 2015, when DNA testing finally confirmed that Nan Britton was telling the truth all along. Harding had indeed fathered a child with her. Nearly a century later, the truth finally caught up with the cover-up. And those love letters? They're now part of the Library of Congress collection. They're not just romantic, they're deeply revealing. In one, Harding writes, "I love your poise of perfect thighs when they hold me fast." Harding, it turns out, wasn't just a political figure. He was a full-blown romantic, with zero sense of restraint. And the irony? While his personal life was a slow-motion scandal, his presidency was also under fire for the Teapot Dome scandal, one of the biggest cases of government corruption in American history. He didn't live to see its fallout. Harding died suddenly in 1923, possibly from a heart attack while still in office. And after Harding's high drama and backroom deals, America got a president who couldn't have been more different, Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge didn't sneak around. He barely talked, but he did enjoy one strange ritual, having his head rubbed with petroleum jelly while eating breakfast in bed. Let's get very quiet and very weird with the next guy. Calvin Coolidge, the president who took breakfast and head massages. If Warren G. Harding was chaos, Calvin Coolidge was the complete opposite. Nicknamed Silent Cal, he was a man of few words, fewer expressions, and almost no interest in flair. But for a president known for stillness, Coolidge had one very strange morning ritual. He liked to have his head rubbed with petroleum jelly while eating breakfast in bed. Yes, that's a real thing. Every morning, Coolidge would sit up in his White House bed with a tray of breakfast, usually including toast, coffee, and a soft-boiled egg. And while he ate in silence, a servant would rub Vaseline into his scalp. No one really knows why. There's no medical record or explanation, but Coolidge insisted on it. Some say it was for his hair. Others claim it was for mental stimulation. Most historians just raise their eyebrows and quietly move on. But the routine was real. The same president who once told a dinner guest, "You lose," after the man bet he could make Coolidge say more than 3 words, also believed greasing his head before 9 a.m. was perfectly normal behavior. And honestly, that sums up Coolidge in a nutshell. He was quirky, but hyper-disciplined. He slept 10 hours a night, took afternoon naps, rarely drank, and while he didn't say much when he did speak, his words carried weight. His presidency was defined by doing less, not more. He slashed taxes, shrank government programs, and famously said, "The business of America is business." He believed in staying out of the way, an approach that earned him both praise and criticism. But through it all, Coolidge remained a mystery, quiet, private, and oddly rigid. Even his own staff often had no idea what he was thinking. He was the type to let a room go awkwardly silent and just let it stay that way. And that Vaseline thing, he never once acknowledged it publicly. Not a joke, not a line in a diary, just one of those strange, intimate White House rituals that somehow leaked into history. But after Coolidge's slow and steady style, the country got something else entirely. Herbert Hoover, the engineer turned president, who would face one of the worst economic disasters in American history and try to fix it with a dog that had its own FBI file. Let's talk about the president whose dog had a better seat in the limo than most humans. Herbert Hoover, the president whose dog had an FBI file. Herbert Hoover was a brilliant engineer, a world-class humanitarian, and, unfortunately for him, the president when the Great Depression hit. But before the stock market crashed, before soup lines and dust bowls, Hoover was known for something else. He had an FBI file on his dog. Yes, really. Hoover's dog was a Belgian shepherd named King Tut, and he wasn't just a family pet. He was a full-blown presidential sidekick. Tut rode in the front seat of Hoover's custom limousine. He posed for official portraits. He even had a dedicated handler and a preferred food menu. But here's where it gets weird. King Tut also had a file with the FBI. During Hoover's presidency, the dog was considered so important to the image of the administration that federal agents were instructed to monitor threats, correspondence, and even public opinion surrounding him. Why? Because Hoover genuinely believed that Tut made him more relatable, a rare quality in a president who often came across as stiff and emotionally distant. He wasn't wrong. Photographs of Hoover playing with Tut were some of the most popular press images of his presidency. In an era before TV and presidential tweets, a friendly-looking dog went a long way. So, naturally, the administration kept an eye on anything that could hurt Tut's image or safety. There are memos, there are reports, there are mentions of concerned citizens writing in about the dog's welfare. One rumor claimed that someone tried to poison King Tut. Unproven, but definitely investigated. Hoover's security detail treated Tut almost like a dignitary, and it wasn't just for show. Hoover was notoriously private and uncomfortable with the press, but with Tut around, he appeared more at ease. In many ways, the dog did the heavy lifting of public relations, and the White House knew it. Ironically, none of it helped when the economy collapsed in 1929. No dog, no matter how photogenic, could save Hoover from being blamed for the Great Depression. His policies were too cautious, too slow, and by the time voters responded, Franklin D. Roosevelt swept into office with a promise of bold, sweeping action. But while Hoover was cautious, Roosevelt was fearless. And after surviving an assassination attempt before even taking office, he proved that no bullet or economic crisis was going to stop him. And then let's talk about the president who took a bullet before the first 100 days and never looked back. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the president who dodged a bullet before day one. When you think of Franklin D. Roosevelt, you think of World War II, the New Deal, the fireside chats, the man who led America through the Great Depression and global war, from a wheelchair no less. But before he even stepped into the White House, Roosevelt had already survived something that could have rewritten history in an instant, an assassination attempt. The date was February 15th, 1933, 3 weeks before his inauguration. FDR was in Miami, giving an impromptu speech from the back of an open car in Bayfront Park. The mood was upbeat. The crowd was massive. Roosevelt smiled, waved, and gave one of his signature off-the-cuff talks. And then the shots rang out. A man named Giuseppe Zangara, an Italian immigrant with anarchist leanings, stood on a folding chair and opened fire with a cheap .32 caliber pistol. He fired 5 shots into the crowd. Roosevelt wasn't hit, but he wasn't far from the danger. Standing next to him in the car was Anton Chermak, the mayor of Chicago. One of Zangara's bullets struck Chermak in the chest. He would die a few weeks later from his wounds. Roosevelt, astonishingly, remained calm. Witnesses say he didn't duck or panic. Instead, he held onto Chermak, comforting him while shouting instructions to the driver and police. The would-be assassin was tackled and arrested immediately. His explanation? I don't like no one. I never have. I never will. Zanger claimed his target was any world leader. Roosevelt just happened to be there, but the implications? Chilling. Had Roosevelt been struck and killed before his inauguration, Vice President-elect John Nance Garner would have become president. There would have been no New Deal, no 100 days, no FDR leading the U.S. through World War II. The entire trajectory of the 20th century might have shifted with just 1 inch of bullet difference. Roosevelt survived and stepped into the White House weeks later with renewed confidence, almost as if fate had given him a second chance. And when he eventually passed away, 12 years and 4 terms later, the presidency landed in the lap of a man with zero warning. Harry S. Truman had barely been briefed, but he brought his poker face, literally. And inside the White House, he built a custom poker table and played for real cash with his advisors. Let's talk about the no-nonsense president who bluffed his way into leadership and dealt with it like a pro. Harry S. Truman, the poker president who played for keeps. Harry S. Truman didn't expect to become president. Not really. He was vice president for just 82 days before Franklin D. Roosevelt died. And suddenly, Truman found himself holding the reins of a country still at war and weeks away from making one of the most devastating decisions in human history. But behind that famously serious stare and the "buck stops here" plaque on his desk was a man who loved poker and wasn't afraid to play it like he played politics, boldly and with real stakes. Truman didn't just enjoy the game. He made it part of the presidency. He had a custom-built poker table installed in the White House. It wasn't some ornamental conversation piece. It was functional, sleek, and designed for real cash games. He'd gather his staff, trusted cabinet members, and close friends for late-night sessions filled with chips, cigars, whiskey, and strategy. And yes, they gambled for money. This wasn't just about relaxation. For Truman, poker was a mental workout, a way to read people, measure risk, and trust his gut. The same instincts he used at the table helped guide his presidential style: blunt, decisive, and unapologetically direct. He wasn't a great poker player in the technical sense. He bluffed too often and took big swings. But that same boldness led him to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan, recognize Israel as a new state, and fire General Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War. Big bets, no hesitation. Staffers say he never lost his cool at the table. If he was holding garbage, he'd play it like gold. If he won, he stayed humble. If he lost, he shrugged it off with a grin and refilled his glass. To him, poker mirrored life, uncertain, fast-moving, and entirely dependent on your nerve. And get this, Truman never had a vice president during his first term. He played the hand he was dealt, alone. When he left office, his approval ratings were in the basement. But history, it's been kinder. Much like his poker face, the value of Truman's decisions didn't show up until the chips were all counted. And his successor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a 5-star general with a war hero's record and a polished public image. But Ike had his own secrets, like suffering a heart attack while in office and trying to cover it up with a golf trip. Let's talk about the president who quietly checked out while pretending to tee off. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the president who had a heart attack and blamed the golf course. Dwight D. Eisenhower was a 5-star general, supreme Allied commander during World War II, and the calm, collected grandfather figure of 1950s America. But behind that all-American smile and military polish was a man with a ticking time bomb in his chest, and a presidency that almost ended with a cover-up on the golf course. In September 1955, during his first term as president, Eisenhower was vacationing in Colorado when he suddenly experienced severe chest pains. At first, his doctors weren't sure what was happening. Was it indigestion, anxiety, just exhaustion? Nope, it was a massive heart attack. Today, that would mean emergency briefings, press conferences, 24-hour news coverage. But in 1955, the White House tried to keep it quiet. At first, the official word was that Eisenhower was just overworked and needed rest after a round of golf. In reality, he was in critical condition. He spent 7 weeks in the hospital. The press received carefully filtered updates. The public was reassured that everything was fine, and Eisenhower, ever the disciplined soldier, played along. He gave updates through dictated letters, smiled for carefully staged photos. One doctor even claimed Ike had simply overexerted himself with too many rounds of golf. Golf apparently was the 1950s version of a sick day excuse. But behind the scenes, there was panic. Eisenhower's team debated invoking the 25th Amendment, which didn't even exist yet. There was no formal process for what to do if a president became incapacitated. Vice President Richard Nixon stayed on standby, but no power was officially transferred. Eisenhower eventually recovered and returned to work, but the incident raised real fears about transparency, health, and presidential fitness, fears that wouldn't go away in the decades to come. Ike would later suffer a stroke in 1957 and another heart attack in 1965 after leaving office, but through it all, he projected calm, order, and stability, even when his body was crumbling behind the curtain. Still, he left office as one of the most popular presidents in U.S. history. His farewell address famously warned of the military-industrial complex, showing that beneath the golf game and the poker face, Eisenhower had serious concerns about the future of American power, and the man who followed him, John F. Kennedy, young, charismatic, and hiding his own health secrets, walked into the Oval Office with movie star charm and a Hollywood smile. But behind the glamour was a man racked with pain, propped up by pills, and fighting battles no one saw. Let's talk about the president whose real weakness was hidden under designer suits and televised perfection. John F. Kennedy, the president held together by painkillers and perfect posture. John F. Kennedy was the picture of cool. Young, handsome, charismatic. His hair didn't move. His speeches stirred millions. His televised debates practically redefined politics. He looked like he belonged on a movie poster, not just in the White House. But while America saw the glow of Camelot, they never saw what was happening behind the curtain, because JFK, at just 43 years old, was falling apart physically. He suffered from chronic debilitating pain, a diagnosis of Addison's disease, and severe back problems that left him dependent on braces, daily injections, and a small pharmacy's worth of medication. By the time he was elected, Kennedy was already taking a cocktail of drugs just to function. He popped painkillers, stimulants, anti-inflammatories, antispasmodics, sleeping pills, you name it. His back was so bad that he had to use crutches privately and even underwent multiple spinal surgeries, one of which nearly killed him. But the public, they saw none of it. His team worked relentlessly to hide his health issues, fearing that any sign of weakness would ruin his image and maybe even cost him the presidency. His press appearances were choreographed down to the smallest detail. He wore a back brace under his tailored suits to maintain perfect posture. He refused to let photographers catch him looking tired or frail. And it worked. JFK became a symbol of youthful energy, even though under the surface, he was propped up by cortisone shots and grit. Even at his most iconic moments, like the Cuban Missile Crisis or his Ich bin ein Berliner speech, he was pushing through pain. The man delivering sharp, powerful speeches to millions was often just hours removed from being hooked up to IV fluids. Doctors who treated him said he had the pain tolerance of a soldier, but that wasn't the version of Kennedy Americans were allowed to see. They saw the legend, the image, the myth. And when he was assassinated in 1963, many wondered, what more could he have done if his body hadn't been failing him every step of the way? The man who stepped into the role next, Lyndon B. Johnson, was nothing like JFK. Loud, domineering, obsessed with power, and fond of White House renovations, exotic pets, and a custom-built shower experience that blasted guests like a car wash. Let's talk about the president who brought pressure, literally and politically. Lyndon B. Johnson, the president who installed a fire hose in his shower. Lyndon B. Johnson didn't believe in doing things halfway. He didn't whisper, he barked. He didn't walk, he stormed. And when it came to personal comfort, he didn't just upgrade the White House shower, he weaponized it. LBJ had a custom shower experience built into the executive residence that became legendary among staffers, plumbers, and unfortunate visitors. This wasn't your typical rainhead with adjustable settings. No. Johnson demanded a system that could hit every part of his body at once, with pressure so intense it could knock a grown man off his feet. And he meant it. The water jets were angled to blast him from multiple directions. One aide described it as more like being sandblasted than bathed. The custom plumbing required constant maintenance, because even the White House pipes couldn't keep up with Johnson's expectations. Why the obsession? LBJ was larger than life, literally and politically. He stood over 6 feet, 3 inches, spoke inches from people's faces, and conducted meetings from the bathroom. And when it came to showers, he believed they should reflect the power of the presidency. He once called a plumber in the middle of the night to complain about water flow during the Vietnam War. But the fire hose shower wasn't just about hygiene. It was symbolic. Johnson wanted force in every aspect of his life. From passing the Civil Rights Act to escalating the war in Vietnam, he pushed everything, policy, pressure, and people, to the max. And the shower became a running, literally joke in the West Wing. Visitors who used it were often unprepared. Some slipped, some yelped, some refused to go near it again. But Johnson, he loved it. He once said he needed water pressure strong enough to peel the hide off a mule. And after a day of bullying senators, signing sweeping legislation, and managing global crises, LBJ retreated into a hydro-powered throne room where only the strongest could survive. But while Johnson cranked up the pressure, the man who came next turned the White House into something else entirely, a bunker of paranoia, recording devices, and whispered secrets. Richard Nixon wasn't interested in showers. He was obsessed with surveillance. And let's talk about the president who bugged his own house and then got caught listening. Richard Nixon, the president who brought himself down with his own tapes. If paranoia had a face, it would look like Richard Nixon. He rose from political obscurity to become a Cold War giant. He opened relations with China, signed arms treaties with the Soviet Union, and pulled America out of Vietnam. But for all that strategic genius, Nixon will always be remembered for one thing. He recorded himself into resignation. That's right. Nixon bugged the Oval Office, his private study, even the cabinet room, and didn't tell anyone. The system he had installed in 1971 was voice-activated, so every whisper, rant, and backroom deal was preserved on tape. At first, the recordings were for accuracy. Nixon claimed he wanted a record of conversations to write his memoirs, but the real reason? Control. Nixon didn't trust anyone, not his aides, not Congress, not even himself. So he built a surveillance state within the West Wing, and it worked until it backfired. In 1972, after the Watergate break-in, the cover-up began unraveling. Congressional investigators started digging. Witnesses testified. And then someone dropped the bombshell. Yes, there are tapes. The revelation turned Watergate from a scandal into a full-blown constitutional crisis. Nixon fought to keep the tapes hidden. The Supreme Court ordered him to turn them over. And when he did, they were worse than anyone imagined. The tapes revealed racism, profanity, political sabotage, and worst of all, proof that Nixon knew about the cover-up and lied about it. One now infamous section, the smoking gun tape, captured Nixon ordering the CIA to obstruct the FBI's investigation. That was it. Game over. Faced with certain impeachment and removal, Nixon became the first and only U.S. president to resign, stepping down in August 1974, all because of a recording system he installed himself. It's almost poetic. A man who built his presidency on secrecy and suspicion, undone by his own surveillance state. He didn't just lose the presidency, he recorded himself losing it. And after Nixon left in shame, the country turned to a man who hadn't even been elected vice president, a quiet Midwesterner named Gerald Ford, whose presidency began with a single controversial decision. He pardoned Nixon. Let's talk about the only president who served without ever winning a national election, and why that pardon nearly cost him everything. Gerald Ford, the president nobody voted for. Gerald R. Ford holds a record no other U.S. president can claim. He was never elected president, and never elected vice president either. He just sort of showed up. It all started with a scandal, not his, but Spiro Agnew's. In 1973, Richard Nixon's vice president resigned in disgrace over charges of bribery and tax evasion. Under the newly ratified 25th Amendment, Nixon nominated Gerald Ford, a long-serving congressman from Michigan, as his replacement. Ford was honest, dependable, and deeply Midwestern. Everything Nixon wasn't. Congress confirmed him. Less than a year later, Nixon resigned in the aftermath of Watergate. Suddenly, Gerald Ford was president. The American people never cast a single vote for him on a national ticket, not once. And on day one, Ford inherited a country exhausted, cynical, and furious. Vietnam was dragging on. Trust in government was at an all-time low, And looming over it all, the ghost of Nixon. So, what did Ford do? He pardoned him. Just 1 month after taking office, Ford announced a full and unconditional pardon for Richard Nixon. The reasoning? He said America needed to move forward, to heal, but the backlash was instant and brutal. Critics accused Ford of making a secret deal. Poll numbers tanked. Protesters flooded the streets. Even allies in Congress turned cold. In a single stroke, Ford went from accidental president to deeply unpopular figure. But here's what people forget. Ford knew it would hurt him. He did it anyway. And decades later, even historians who once criticized the move have called it necessary for the country to regain its footing. Ford's time in office was brief. Just 895 days. He fought inflation, survived 2 assassination attempts, and pushed for economic reform. But he never fully recovered from the pardon, and in 1976, he lost to a little-known peanut farmer from Georgia named Jimmy Carter. And Carter, he walked into the White House not with scandal, but with a suitcase in hand, refusing to ride in the limo, choosing instead to walk to the Capitol on Inauguration Day. Let's talk about the president who promised honesty, wore cardigans, and once battled a swamp rabbit. Jimmy Carter, the president who fought off a swamp rabbit. Jimmy Carter was a deeply moral man, a peanut farmer, a Sunday school teacher, a soft-spoken president who promised truth after years of lies. But in the spring of 1979, all of that was temporarily overshadowed by something no one saw coming. He was attacked by a swamp rabbit. Yes, that's a real sentence. Carter was fishing alone in a small boat on a pond near his home in Georgia when a large, wet, and very angry rabbit started swimming toward him. Now, most rabbits are skittish, cute, and harmless, but swamp rabbits? Bigger, meaner. And this one clearly didn't care that it was charging the leader of the free world. According to Carter, the rabbit was making a beeline for the boat, ears back, teeth bared, hissing as it paddled furiously through the water. The president, startled and alone, grabbed a paddle and splashed water at the rabbit to drive it away. It worked. The rabbit swam off. No harm done. End of story? Not quite. Back at the White House, Carter told the tale to his staff. They didn't believe him. A rabbit attack? Seriously? But here's the twist. There was a photographer at the pond, and he caught the moment on camera. The photo showed a clearly panicked Carter waving a paddle at something in the water. When the story finally reached the press months later, they ran wild with it. Headlines dubbed it the Killer Rabbit Attack. Editorial cartoons showed Carter losing a battle with a bunny. Political opponents mocked it as symbolic of his presidency. Reactive, unprepared, and soft. Never mind that Carter had fended off a wild animal while fishing alone. In the court of public opinion, the rabbit won. But here's what matters more. Carter didn't panic. He didn't call the Secret Service. He didn't spin the story. He laughed it off. That was Carter. Honest to a fault. A little awkward, completely unfiltered. He was the only president to send his son to public school while in office. He wore cardigans in the White House to save energy. And after he left office, he didn't disappear. He picked up a hammer and started building homes for the poor. But the man who followed him brought a very different energy. Ronald Reagan walked into the White House like a movie set. Literally, a former actor with polished delivery, cowboy charisma, and some seriously weird beliefs, including using astrologers to schedule presidential events. Let's talk about the president who ran the free world, by the stars. Ronald Reagan, the president who scheduled by the stars. Ronald Reagan knew how to deliver a line. He was the great communicator, a former actor turned politician who gave speeches like movie monologues and smiled like he knew how the story would end. But behind the scenes, the stars were calling the shots. After Reagan survived an assassination attempt in 1981, things changed. Especially for Nancy Reagan. The shooting had shaken her deeply, and she was determined to do everything possible to protect her husband. So she turned to the cosmos. Enter Joan Quigley, a San Francisco astrologer with no official government title, but enormous influence in the Reagan White House. Nancy began consulting her regularly, and soon Quigley's advice began shaping the presidential calendar. Not just birthdays or personal events, we're talking speeches, debates, travel, meetings, even medical procedures. If Mercury was in retrograde, or a full moon loomed too close to a flight plan, Nancy would flag it and schedules would shift. Reagan's top staff initially thought it was a joke until they were told not to schedule anything important on certain days because the planets weren't aligned right. At one point, Reagan's chief of staff described himself as running a government in which the planets were part of the staff. The situation became so surreal that even the timing of Air Force One takeoffs was occasionally based on astrological charts. And Ronald? He publicly downplayed it. Privately, he didn't object. He trusted Nancy. And if that meant letting an astrologer help pick his best day for a summit with Gorbachev, so be it. Now, to be fair, Reagan wasn't the first leader to believe in signs and symbols, but he may have been the first modern president whose daily schedule was influenced by zodiac charts in a nuclear age. Still, it didn't seem to hurt him. Reagan remained one of the most popular presidents in modern history. He helped end the Cold War, transformed the conservative movement, and made optimism part of his brand, even if it came with a little cosmic guidance. And when he finally left office, he handed the keys to George H.W. Bush, his loyal vice president and a man who brought with him decades of experience, a love for skydiving, and a stomach of steel, even when vomiting on the Japanese prime minister. Let's talk about the president whose worst foreign policy moment happened at dinner. George H.W. Bush, the president who threw up on the prime minister. George H.W. Bush had one of the most impressive resumes in presidential history. World War II pilot, UN ambassador, CIA director, vice president, and eventually president of the United States. But despite decades of experience, one of the most unforgettable moments of his presidency had nothing to do with policy, diplomacy, or war. It happened over sushi. On January 8, 1992, while attending a formal state dinner in Tokyo, President Bush suddenly became pale and sluggish. He was sitting beside Japanese Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa, enjoying a carefully curated meal of traditional dishes when it happened. Without warning, Bush leaned over and vomited directly onto the Prime Minister's lap, and then he fainted. For a few tense seconds, the room froze. Secret Service agents rushed in. Barbara Bush leaned over to help. Photographers captured it all. In a matter of minutes, the most powerful man in the world went from global leader to international incident. The footage quickly became one of the most replayed clips of the decade. It was looped endlessly on TV and spoofed on late-night comedy shows worldwide. The Japanese press even coined a new slang verb, bushu suru, meaning to do a bush, as in to throw up in public. To his credit, Bush laughed it off. He recovered quickly and returned to duty within hours. The cause? A combination of flu-like symptoms and exhaustion from his rigorous travel schedule. But the damage, at least to his image, was done. The moment became shorthand for a presidency struggling with the economy and slipping public support. Still, Bush's resume remained unmatched. He oversaw the end of the Cold War, the Gulf War victory, and the signing of NAFTA's groundwork. But in the eyes of many, that single moment in Tokyo became a symbol of his vulnerability, and the moment his re-election hopes started to look shaky. And when he left office, he passed the torch to a younger, flashier, saxophone-playing newcomer from Arkansas. Bill Clinton walked into the White House with charm, scandal, and marketing savvy. And when bootleg copies of his autobiography hit the streets early, he did what no president had done before. He sent in federal agents to shut the whole thing down. Let's talk about the president who turned book leaks into FBI raids. Bill Clinton, the president who sent the feds after book pirates. Bill Clinton was the first president to truly understand the power of brand. He could charm a room, dominate a town hall, and play saxophone on late-night TV like a rock star. But when someone tried to profit off his life story before he had the chance to tell it himself, he didn't smile it off. He sent in the feds. In the early 2000s, just before the release of Clinton's memoir, My Life, unauthorized copies began circulating in certain U.S. cities. Bootleg paperback versions, often riddled with typos and missing chapters. These knockoffs were sold from sidewalks and corner stores, often for just a few bucks. To most politicians, it might have seemed like small-time grifting, but to Clinton, it was an attack on his story, his legacy, and, let's be honest, his royalties. So he did what few presidents before him had ever done. He called in federal law enforcement. The FBI launched raids in New York and other cities, confiscating fake copies, arresting sellers, and even warning small-time vendors that pushing Clinton's pirated life story could land them in real trouble. One vendor told reporters, "I've sold knockoff shoes and CDs for years. I never thought a book would get me busted," but that's how seriously Clinton took his narrative. He'd already lived through the scandals, the affairs, the impeachment, the nonstop tabloid coverage. My life was his shot to tell the story his way, on his terms, and he wasn't going to let a bootleg version undermine that. The official book, when it dropped, became a bestseller overnight. At over 900 pages, it was dense, detailed, and, depending on who you ask, a literary flex or political PR blitz. Either way, it was pure Clinton. Smooth, clever, and endlessly complex. And that's exactly how he ran the presidency. Clinton blended pop culture with policy, press savvy with political maneuvering, and always seemed one step ahead of the media chasing him. But when he handed off the Oval Office, he passed it to a man with a very different vibe. George W. Bush wasn't a sax-playing academic. He was a straight-talking Texan with a cowboy swagger, and when he met Vladimir Putin for the first time, Bush didn't size him up with diplomacy. He sized him up through a dogfight. Let's talk about the president who started his first global summit with a puppy power move. George W. Bush, the president who got into a dog duel with Putin. George W. Bush was all about gut instinct. He famously said he looked into Vladimir Putin's eyes and got a sense of his soul. But a few years later, he used something a little more furry to size Putin up. A dog. It started during a diplomatic visit. Bush brought Putin to his ranch in Crawford, Texas. It was classic Bush hospitality. Barbecue boots and his beloved Scottish terrier, Barney. Barney was tiny, energetic, and fiercely loyal. He followed Bush everywhere and had his own official White House holiday videos. Bush was proud of him. So when Putin arrived, Bush bent down, scooped up Barney, and introduced him like a member of the family. Putin's response? He smirked and said, "You call that a dog?" A few months later, Bush visited Russia, and that's when Putin struck back. He brought out Coney, his massive black Labrador. The dog strutted into the room, tail high, muscular, and alert. Putin looked at Bush and said, "Now this is a dog." Everyone laughed. But Bush didn't forget it. He later told reporters, "You're either a dog person or not," and Vlad was definitely showing off. It was more than just canine banter. It was classic geopolitical posturing. Two world leaders, two dogs, one not-so-subtle message. Putin's power is bigger than yours. This dog duel became one of those weird, almost too good to be true anecdotes that says everything about both men. Bush, the rancher with the scrappy terrier and Texas charm. Putin, the ex-KGB man with a stoic Labrador and steel-eyed stare. And while it didn't spark an actual international incident, it showed how even presidential diplomacy can turn into a flex-off with pets. Bush, for his part, leaned into the humor. He knew people underestimated him. He misspoke, made folksy gaffes, and famously said, "I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully." But behind the smirks, he navigated 9/11, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a collapsing economy with more complexity than he was often given credit for. And when he left office, he handed the presidency to a man known for his precision, poise, and powerfully controlled image. Barack Obama walked into the White House with history on his shoulders and carried a homebrewed honey ale in his briefcase. Let's talk about the first president who ran the country and his own brewery. Barack Obama, the president who brewed beer in the White House. Barack Obama made history the moment he took the oath of office. But somewhere between tackling the Great Recession, passing healthcare reform, and delivering smooth as silk speeches, he also made a different kind of history. One that tasted like hops, malt, and just a hint of White House honey. Obama became the first president to brew beer inside the White House, and he didn't just slap his name on a label. He helped fund it, taste, test it, and even offered up some ideas for flavor. It all started when Obama met a home brewer on the campaign trail. The guy handed him a bottle of craft beer and joked, "You should try this, it's presidential." Obama laughed, and then went back to Washington and told the White House kitchen staff to start brewing. The result? a line of home-brewed beers made with ingredients from the White House kitchen garden, including honey harvested from Michelle Obama's beehives. The names: White House Honey Ale, White House Honey Porter, White House Honey Blonde. It was a small touch, but a symbolic one. In a place known for crystal stemware and French service, Obama introduced craft beer culture to Pennsylvania Avenue. He served it at Super Bowl parties to visiting heads of state, and even gave bottles to members of the press. And of course, people wanted the recipe. So in classic internet era fashion, a petition was started on the White House website demanding it. Obama responded, the recipe was published, and suddenly Americans were homebrewing presidential beer in their kitchens. It was the most down-to-earth power move a modern president could make. Share a drink made with garden-grown honey, brewed in the people's house and served like any neighbor on a back porch. But the White House brewery didn't survive the next administration. The man who followed Obama had a very different vibe. Donald J. Trump didn't care for beer, didn't drink it, didn't serve it, but he did make history in other ways, like becoming the first president to be impeached twice, and the only one with a WWE Hall of Fame ring. Let's talk about the commander-in-chief who body-slammed political tradition, sometimes literally. Donald Trump, the president who body-slammed a billionaire on live TV. You've probably heard that Donald J. Trump did things differently. He came into the presidency not as a politician, but as a brand, a reality TV star, a name stamped on gold towers, steaks, airlines, and bottled water. But if you want a moment that truly captures how Trumpian his rise was, it wasn't in a debate, a press conference, or even on the campaign trail. It was in the wrestling ring. In 2007, long before he launched his presidential run, Trump took part in WWE's WrestleMania 23 in what was billed as the Battle of the Billionaires. He didn't just show up ringside in a suit, he got involved. The storyline was this: Trump and WWE owner Vince McMahon each chose a wrestler to represent them. The loser would get their head shaved bald. Classic pro wrestling drama. But halfway through the match, in front of millions of viewers, Trump ran into the ring, tackled McMahon, and body slammed him to the mat. He even pretended to throw punches while the crowd went wild. When his wrestler won, Trump stood by while McMahon's head was shaved, gleefully rubbing it in. It was absurd. It was choreographed. And it was very on brand. That moment earned Trump a spot in the WWE Hall of Fame, where he was officially inducted in 2013. And while it might seem like just a bizarre blip in pop culture history, it turned out to be weirdly prophetic. Because Trump's campaign, and later his presidency, played out with WWE-style energy. Insults, chants, surprise twists, and a base of supporters who treated politics more like a spectacle than a debate. He broke norms, shattered traditions, became the first president impeached twice, and through it all, he kept a fighter's mindset, always on offense, always framing himself as the underdog in a grudge match. Love him or loathe him, Trump redefined what a presidency could look like, and in many ways, he previewed it all that night in the ring. And now, he's the only president whose face has appeared on a wrestling promo and on a ballot. The man who followed him into the White House brought the tone back to something quieter, older, even. Joe Biden stepped into office as the oldest president in U.S. history. And here's the kicker. He's older than 13 past presidents combined. Let's talk about the man who took the oath with more experience and more candles on the cake than any president before him. Joe Biden, the president older than 13 presidents combined. When Joe Biden took the oath of office on January 20th, 2021, he didn't just become president, he became a record breaker. At 78 years old, Biden was, and still is, the oldest person ever elected to the presidency. But that's not even the craziest part. He was older at inauguration than 13 past presidents were combined when they took office. Let that sink in. At 78, Biden had already outlived James K. Polk, James Garfield, William McKinley, and JFK. He was older than Teddy Roosevelt, Ulysses S. Grant, and Barack Obama were when they first entered politics. He'd been a senator for decades, a vice president, a widower, a father who buried a child, and a man who had twice watched his presidential dreams flame out. And still, he came back. Biden's age became both a punchline and a point of pride. Critics called him slow. Supporters called him seasoned, but Biden leaned into it. He wore aviators, cracked grandpa jokes, and leaned on empathy, patience, and political muscle memory, refined over half a century in public life. And while his presidency has been anything but simple, marked by pandemic recovery, inflation battles, and deep national division, there's no denying the symbolism of his win. A country battered by chaos elected a man who had seen everything and still showed up. And if age is just a number, his number tells a story. One of resilience, reinvention, and longevity. He's the final page, for now, in a long, strange presidential saga that spans powdered wigs, dueling generals, poker games, rabbit attacks, secret surgeries, and yes, the WWE body slam. Because the truth is, when it comes to American presidents, weird is the standard, not the exception.